Ever felt like you've spent so much time leveling and gearing a main only to find out that it's not fun anymore and that you kinda wasted all your time? Hey guys, Gongrongzong here. In this video series we're going to explore together all the different classes and specs in Battle for Azeroth in a bite-sized format for PvE situations. And by doing so, it's my hope that you'll be able to get a better idea of what spec or class to main in Battle for Azeroth. Just as an additional but important point, everything that we go through will be based on the design philosophy of the spec and not to do with the raw number output. That is, how much damage or healing or damage absorption the spec is able to perform. Numbers can and will always be constantly tweaked, so that is not what we're focusing on in this guide. Let's start off with the Pharaoh Druid, a spec that I personally main for many years. In a nutshell, here are the basic pros and cons of the Pharaoh Druid spec going into PvE situations in Battle for Azeroth. Pros: very high single target damage, consistently high mobility, and very strong defensives. However, their con would be their lackluster AoE. From the ground up, Pharaoh Druids were designed to have very high single target damage. The core damage abilities of a Pharaoh come from two very hard hitting abilities, Rip and Rake. Both of these abilities apply a large damage over time bleed or dot to the target. However, as a design trade-off, Pharaohs have very weak, simplified, and I dare say clunky abilities for AoE. This was a persistent problem in Legion and required certain legendaries to back up any significant AoE output from a Pharaoh. But with legendaries now taken out again, and with the current nerfs to the design mechanics of Brutal Slash, a Pharaoh's only slaving grace for AoE damage, the Pharaoh has returned back to its traditional roots of high single target DPS and pretty lackluster AoE DPS. Pharaohs also have the highest consistent mobility in the game. All Pharaohs move at a constant base speed of 145%, in or out of stealth. Their sprint ability, Dash, has now also been reduced from a 3 to a 2-minute cooldown in Battle for Azeroth. When talented into Wild Charge, which is what you're probably going to talent into regardless of the situation, they also possess a 15-second cooldown charge, one of the shortest cooldown charges in the game. Lastly, they also possess Stampeding Roar, an ability that is slightly shorter in duration than Dash but applies to all your allies in your vicinity. So in terms of mobility, Pharaohs are one of the best out there. Moving out of the fire and getting back to the boss has never been easier for this spec. In PvE situations, Pharaohs also have one of the easiest to apply and strongest damage mitigation abilities out there, Survival Instincts, an ability that grants you a flat 50% damage reduction, has 2 charges, and is on a 1-minute cooldown. In addition to this, they are easily able to survive or soak any raid-wide damage mechanics by changing into bear form, granting you increased health and armor, and also by popping Survival Instincts at the same time. So those are the basic pros and cons that the Pharaoh Druid has been designed around. Very strong single target DPS, high mobility, strong defensives, but lackluster AoE. Now let's see how exactly the Pharaoh Druid plays out in terms of their gameplay. First off, and most importantly, unlike many other specs in WoW, the Pharaoh is not a button mashing spec. It may have been momentarily in the last patch of Legion, but besides that, it has always traditionally been a methodical, complex and energy pooling spec. And looking at how it currently is in Battle for Azeroth, it seems to be returning to its roots. To start off, the Pharaoh Druid is not an easy spec to play. In fact, it's probably one of the hardest, if not the hardest DPS spec to perform well with. This is due to a mechanic known as dot snapshotting, but has been more commonly known as bleed snapshotting due to its uniqueness to Pharaoh Druids. What does snapshotting mean? Well, Pharaoh Druids have certain key abilities that buff your damage for a set amount of time, namely Tiger's Fury, Blood Talons, and Savage Roar. Each of these abilities function independently of one another, and each lasts for a different duration and provide a different amount of flat damage increase. In order for a Pharaoh to maximize his damage, they must use their bleed abilities during the existing duration of their damage boosting abilities. So for example, if I cast Tiger's Fury, an ability that boosts all the damage done by the Pharaoh Druid by 15% for a set amount of time, the Rake ability that I cast within the duration of the Tiger's Fury will have its damage boosted by 15% for the entire duration of that Rake. If I have both Blood Talons and Tiger's Fury up at the same time, the Rake that I cast will have its damage boosted by 40% for its entire duration. This may seem simple at the beginning of the rotation, but quickly becomes complicated as the different buffs drop off at different times and they all go on their own respective cooldowns. The Pharaoh is all about resource management, pooling your energy at the right time to execute the most efficient order of bleed snapshotting that you are able to pull off at the current situation. There is no set rotation for this spec. It requires you to think several steps ahead of what you're going to do, and it requires you to have intimate knowledge of the boss encounters in order to anticipate what offensive abilities to use in the next 5 or 10 seconds. It is not by any means a spec that is about hitting buttons when they light up, and in fact it's the complete opposite of it, a stark contrast to how most other classes in WoW are currently played. It is also almost impossible to keep track of all your uptimes without external add-ons to help. You have to keep track of how much energy you have, 3 different damage buffing abilities, and 2 different bleed abilities all at the same time. In a sense, the Pharaoh Druid is a high risk, high reward class. If you're able to pull off your bleed snapshotting right, it is likely that you will be the top DPS in the raid. However, it is also very easy to mess up, and it becomes extremely punishing to your overall DPS when you mess up even one instancing of this snapshotting. As you can probably tell, all this buff snapshotting set up for your bleeds will require quite a bit of uptime, compounding the already clunky AoE abilities that Pharaohs possess. This ultimately requires a Pharaoh to perform a lot of tab targeting, which essentially means constantly changing targets to apply a single bleed to every one of them, complicating an already difficult gameplay into an even more complex one. Overall, being bereft of legendaries in Battle for Azeroth, Pharaohs seem to be in a less than ideal place for certain PvE content, namely Mythic dungeons which require substantial amounts of AoE capabilities. In the same vein, they will also not be very suitable for raid boss encounters that have multiple adds to deal with. While this can be solved with number tweaking, that is, arbitrarily buffing up the damage coefficients of their current AoE abilities, the design philosophy of the Pharaoh Druid just seems very much geared towards very high skill cap single target DPS, with AoE DPS as a secondary design consideration. That being said, however, that has never stopped me from performing well with a Pharaoh Druid, even if I had to do tab targeting AoE damage during the beginning of Legion. If you enjoy playing a spec that has a very high skill cap, is difficult to learn, and even harder to master, a spec that you will have very few people playing it due to its very nature, and coming with its own perks such as substantial amounts of mobility and defensives for boss encounters, then the Pharaoh Druid might just be a pick for you. And that's a wrap. I hope I've been able to provide some insight into how this class and spec works on a basic level. At the end of the day, just give the class a try yourself to see if you might like it. If you have any thoughts at all, don't hesitate to leave a comment below. A huge thank you to all my patrons for supporting me thus far, and as always, I'll see you in Azeroth.